Hello. Hi, welcome to the 2018 FNCE session titled Nutrition Interventions Amidst an Opioid Crisis, the emerging role of the registered dietitian nutritionist. Please access the FNCE mobile app to view the session handouts, details, and speaker information. You can submit your questions anytime on this app. I will be monitoring that, and I look forward to those questions. And at the end, we'll be having a really lively question and answer session because I know your speaker, and it will be awesome. Again, thank you for coming. My name is Tammy Beasley. I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist, and I'm also Vice President of Clinical Nutrition Services for Alsana, an eating recovery community. But what I am most excited about today is that I have the honor, privilege, and pleasure to introduce our next speaker to you. David Wiss is the founder of Nutrition in Recovery, which specializes in addictions, eating disorders, mental health, body image, and general wellness in the Los Angeles area. Mr. Wiss works closely with individuals to help them revolutionize their relationship with food. He is a nationally recognized expert in nutrition for addiction and is currently working on his PhD in public health from UCLA. Mr. Wiss has authored several journal articles on addictions and eating disorders, including a recent one in our Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics this year. So please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to be here. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Tammy. Every once in a while we meet people along the journey that we just automatically connect with. And when I met you several years ago, it was like that happened. And we became instant colleagues and friends. And the guru in me recognizes the guru in you. And thank you to everyone that's here. This is a big topic. And I'm thrilled to be able to represent the dietitian in speaking about the opioid crises. A couple background things about me, my disclosures that I do own a private practice in Los Angeles. I did my undergrad at USC in social science. I did my master's at Cal State Northridge, and my mentor and advisor, Dr. Terry Lissagor, is here, and I'm really thrilled. I've been in private practice for many years and recently went back to get a PhD in UCLA. I work full-time, and I'm in a full-time PhD program. My main goal in going back to school was to promote the role of nutrition in substance use disorder recovery. There isn't a lot of evidence, so I'll be able to share with you guys the evidence that we do have. I'm going to give you an overview first on the opioid crisis in general. We will talk about how the opioids affect nutritional status, particularly gastrointestinal health. We'll talk about eating disorders, and then there's some solution at the end. I have published some guidelines that are actually coming out later this month, and I've included them. I do talk very fast. The slides are dense, but I don't plan to cover every word on every slide. If you use the app, the slides are there, 6 per slide. You can take it to a website and email it to yourself. You'll probably need to pull it up on a full screen because it's really small, but if we don't get to every detail, that's available, and I'm also available to answer questions afterwards, emails, etc. I am dedicated to this work. The work that I do is grounded in the biopsychosocial model, which really looks at the integration of environmental, social, psychosocial factors, social determinants at the biological level and how they interplay. It looks at things as a system rather than just from a singular lens. It uses multiple lenses to look at a problem, and it's a perfect way to view the opioid crises. And if you look at this kind of overview of biopsychosocial, you could see there's different domains: psychological, biological, behavioral, etc. At the intersection of it all, you see things like pain and addictive disorders, both things that we're going to be talking about today. So biopsychosocial has started to blow up in the last few decades. You could see the amount of research articles that have been indexed in growth. So using this perspective to talk about the opioid crises, we're going to cover 3 interacting perspectives: the environmental factors, in other words, the supply of the opioids and how that affects consumption. We're going to look at psychosocial factors such as PTSD, stress, trauma, very briefly, as well as adverse childhood experiences. And then we'll talk a little bit about biology, which can include things like genetics, microbiome, and certainly nutrition. So we all know we're in a public health emergency. Since 2000, there has been more than 500,000 drug overdoses, mostly which have come from opioids. There's a higher prevalence in rural environments and in the white population, and there is a growing risk in adolescents. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with this data. The abuse and the death is on the rise, and it has not stopped. We have not made any progress to date to stop the trends. So it is a very significant public health crisis, and we're looking drastically for new solutions. And I'm here to tell you that there's hope, and I'm going to propose some of those solutions today. The common painkillers include Vicodins, codeines, morphines. Fentanyl's gotten a lot of press. Carfentanil is a synthetic version. OxyContin's the big one. You could see from 1996 to 2000, the sales went up 20-fold or something. And that's gotten a lot of attention in the news. And there's been a lot of lawsuits and whatnot against the makers of OxyContin. In 2001, the Joint Commission issued this fifth vital sign, which allowed people to identify pain. And there's that famous question, where are you on the scale of 1 to 10? So there's been regulatory pressure to prescribe more opioids, and some people see this as a dual epidemic, one of abuse and the other is to control pain. And so there's all these question marks. We don't know all the answers. There's a lot of people that are against changing the laws around prescribing because they have legitimate pain and they need their opioids. So there's a lot more questions and answers, but there's certainly been a lot of misuse, a lot of fraud, and there's a lot of busts that are starting to happen. If you guys have heard of pill mills being raided, there's a lot of fraud in addiction treatment, and some of this stuff is starting to come to the light. And I think as it comes to the light and new treatment models are proposed, we are in a position to potentially get involved. Data shows that about half of patients taking prescription opioids are still using them after 5 years. The makers of OxyContin came around in 2010 and released an abuse deterrent formula. If you could see from that slide, as OxyContin use went down, heroin use went up. So a lot of people that were on prescription pain medications have transitioned to illicit opioids because they're cheaper, they're dependent on them. And between 2010 and 2014, heroin-related deaths tripled in the United States. So opioid prescription medications fall under, the healthcare system, whereas all of these other illicit things like heroin fall under the legal system and the DEA, and that's a whole nother topic which could be saved for another day. So to look at the problem on the supply side, this is the environmental theory of the opioid crisis. Looking at how big pharma has aggressively marketed addictive products to physicians, people have overprescribed, and a lot of the heroin users started with prescription opioids somewhat innocently. So the big question is, if we just change the supply, will that be sufficient enough, right? And some people say, yes, we need policy interventions, and I would definitely agree. There's a big push now towards medication-assisted treatment, also known as MAT. They've expanded the availability of it, and it's kind of becoming the mainstream. If you were to search for evidence-based treatment for opioid disorder, not shockingly, this is what would come up, right? Using other medications to ease the withdrawal, and there's definitely some controversy there. The main ones are Suboxone. Methadone has been around for a long time, and Subutex got popular, and now the most common one is Suboxone. And there's several new things that are coming on the market. Vivitrol, either they've got implants, shots. There's a lot of different avenues. And I'm from Los Angeles, and I'll tell you, there's also a lot of busts happening related to fraud with medication-assisted treatment. Big industry, huge stuff, huge topics, and it's important to be able to look at it from all sides of the coin. So there's $1 billion being allocated towards reducing prescription drug misuse. There's a lot of funding. This is high up there on the political agenda. To continue looking at the environmental theory, the supply side, there's a lot of other facets. The marketing, the irresponsible prescribing, and there's solutions being proposed, right? Being able to monitor healthcare system, integrating the information technology, ER guidelines, etc. But then the big question, where does all the pain come from, right? If people are using opioids to reduce underlying psychological pain, right? And you take the pain away, take the drugs away, and the pain's still there, what are people going to do, right? So this is the other kind of theory of the opioid crisis, looking at the psychosocial factors. Is it emotional pain? Is it psychological pain? So there's a lot of people proposing that this is the self-medication hypothesis. People are using opioids, and that each person is different. For example, if someone gets prescribed OxyContin and they don't have a lot of underlying psychosocial vulnerability, they might not get addicted, whereas someone that has unresolved emotional pain will end up transitioning through hardcore addiction. So different people are differently vulnerable to addiction, and to look upstream would be to consider how we can address the underlying pain, and this is the world of mental health, therapy, psychology, etc. So as you can see, an adverse environment, whether in childhood or in teens or at any age, will affect people differently. Where I'm interested is to know how these psychosocial factors get under the skin and can impact the way reward is processed in the brain. So the dopamine system, the opioid system, if these things are altered, it makes one more susceptible to addictive processes. So the idea of social vulnerability does challenge the brain disease model of addiction. There's people that look at addiction solely as deficits in dopamine signaling function. And social theories are looking at it more at the neighborhood level, social isolation, attachment styles, etc. And I would never suggest that one theory is right and one theory is wrong. The truth is they come from different disciplines. Different people that are experts in different things study problems from different lenses. And the biopsychosocial model of health learns to take different lenses that people look at different problems and integrate them into one. Social vulnerability is very important. It's a lot of what gets researched in the community health sciences at UCLA where I'm studying. It looks at how social factors get under the skin and affect people, structural racism, socioeconomic status, etc. So what is trauma? There's a lot of forms of it. Most people know PTSD, but there's also complex trauma, which isn't necessarily an event, but it's the living legacy of that event and how it affects people moving forward, possibly without them even knowing it. Stress, adverse childhood experiences have been linked in a dose-dependent fashion to addiction and alcohol issues. So the higher ACE scores people have, the more likely they are to report and have diagnoses for substance use disorder, opioid use disorder, etc. So there's a lot of different biological correlates of trauma. Hippocampus, amygdala, these are parts of the brain where we process memories, emotions, etc. There's a lot of growing interest in the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve connects the back of the brainstem to different areas of the gut and the enteric nervous system. I'm obsessed with the vagus nerve. I want to learn more about it. There's a lot of research happening, and it's definitely got a lot of promise. So if you haven't done some background on it, I think we're going to get a lot more information about that in the next 10 years. And then there's obviously other neurobiological measures, cortisol, genetics, epigenetics, which we'll touch on briefly. So PTSD increases the risk of developing a heroin or other opioid use disorder. It is found to be more pronounced in men than women, and it's consistent with the self-medication hypothesis. So if someone has underlying trauma, they end up finding ways to reduce the pain. And this isn't just true with addictions. There's actually a lot of good research coming out that shows the same for eating disorders and other behavioral health and mental health issues. But in a nutshell, it changes the way the brain processes reward, and it can increase things like impulsivity. So this diagram just kind of connects some of those dots between trauma, altered reward, anhedonia, and substance use, and then back through the cycling, craving cascade, etc. The trauma theory is important. It looks at the individual, which is highly influenced by social and environmental factors. As we've discussed, how painful life experiences can alter physiology and increase the likelihood of an opioid addiction. The solution proposed is to not look at the supply of the opioids, but to look more at the underlying social factors that contribute to trauma. The hope is that if you can address those things upstream, people will be less likely to become addicted to opioids. Moving on to the biology. As a dietitian, I studied biology and biochemistry, and I think it's really important to be able to, like I said, look at a problem from all these different lenses. And the opioid crisis definitely has some biological factors which are important, which we will be talking about today. The most basic understanding of addiction comes through an understanding of the dopamine system. There's a lot of other systems involved, so it's never just one neurotransmitter. There's other acetylcholine, GABA, and they work in tandem and in conjunction with one another. Most of the research that's done on addiction is done in animal models because, at least at the neuroscience level, it's hard to get an IRB to approve of brain surgery on humans. So we're limited in our understanding. We have PET scans, but a lot of the rodent data, we match it with what we know behaviorally to truly understand addiction. There are some genetic researchers which have started to identify certain risk factors genetically for addiction. Particularly at the dopamine D2 receptor site, there's a part of the brain that receives dopamine neurons, and if the receptor site is downregulated and there's less receptors, it drives an individual to seek more of a substance, to be more impulsive, and this is a controversial yet growing area of research. So most interestingly, in my opinion, is how we look at genetic vulnerability mixed with psychosocial vulnerability. And if someone happens to have both, how that can really cement in the likelihood of becoming addicted to something like heroin or OxyContin, et cetera. And this hasn't been really studied, right? If someone has genetic predisposition, plus they have high ACE scores, and that comes together, we're looking at now a much more likelihood of an addiction. And in the research world, one of the things about collecting data is to be able to build models to be able to predict the future. And when we have 180 roughly people dying per day, there is a great need for models to be able to predict someone's susceptibility to opioid addiction so that we can step in earlier on along the way. Epigenetics is important, and I don't have a lot of time to go into much of it. The one particular site that caught my attention is the mu opioid receptor site, also known as MORE. We've seen that stressful circumstances, whether early on or even later, can be transmittable at the generational level. And this is true for drugs of abuse and has also been shown to be true with highly palatable food. One of our papers last year looked at how what a mother eats during pregnancy can affect the neurodevelopment of the offspring. And again, a lot of this is still in its nascent stages with animal research. But what we know is that if something is rewarding, it leaves a biological imprint on the brain, and that can be passed along to future generations. Definitely an area of growing interest. This is from the New England Journal of Medicine. Recently, Dr. Volkow is one of the big names in the addiction research. I'm not going to try to break this diagram down, but I'll tell you this. As a dietitian, one of the most important things that I've done for my career is to study the neurobiology of addiction, because the reward pathways in the brain are what influence and govern human behavior. I think, psychological factors, social factors are really important, but a big predictor of human behavior is the dopamine response that people get from stuff. And this is going to be different from person to person, and it turns out that food is highly influenced by the dopaminergic response. So understanding the cascade of craving and the way the brain has a bias towards novelty and all these other constructs that are studied in psychiatry and addiction has really helped me understand eating and feeding behavior. way beyond the basics of just like make a good choice, right? Like it goes way beyond the rational brain. Drugs of abuse, highly palatable food alter our neurophysiology in a way that's a predictor of our future behavior. So I would encourage dietitians to get interested in neuroscience. I mean, it is imperative to understand neuroscience in order to understand nutrition, in my opinion. So this is criteria from the DSM-5, substance use disorder. I'm not going to go through them all, but if you were to think about food, for example, you could match the criteria up really closely. If you thought about an unsuccessful efforts to quit, using despite knowledge of problems, craving for the substance, etc. This is an important and somewhat controversial area. Nutrition for mental health is my lane. It's my specialty. I've been following the research for a long time, did my master's thesis on this stuff, and originally it looked at vitamin and minerals and deficiencies. The assumption that I made when I was a master's student was like, if you can figure out what drug addictions are associated with what nutrient deficiencies, you could correct those, right? You could correct the deficiencies associated with meth or with heroin. And that was an assumption based on the training that I have, and it's somewhat valid, but we've gone further now, right? We're not just looking at deficiencies, we're looking at a lot of other things like gut health, microbiome, inflammation, food sensitivities, all the stuff that we're learning about here at FNCE, all the hot topics. So historically, nutrition and mental health was focused on amino acids, like I said, vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, and now we've got some really hot stuff that we're going to talk about today. Just to give a quick overview, it's my opinion that in order to really work in substance use disorder, it is imperative that you, one, understand the neuroscience of addiction, two, you have to understand eating disorders, and you have to be able to message nutrition correctly in a way that does not cause harm, and three, to understand gastrointestinal health. And the thing about those three areas is that they're like different fields in their own, right? And they have a lot of overlap, but there's also a lot of areas where they diverge, right? Where the message could be different. And so it's an art to be able to understand information from different disciplines and bring it together to be able to tailor a nutrition message for one person. It's also one of the reasons why it's hard to do group education, right? Because you do group education in a treatment center, and you've got some people that need like a message this way, and other people that are more on an eating disorder spectrum that might need a slightly different message. And I think that is the future, understanding nutrition at a more individual level, right? The assumption that you could just message nutrition to 20 people and that it would all be the right thing for all 20 people, in my opinion, is old and naive. So there's a bidirectional overlap between substance use disorder and eating disorder, neurochemically as well as behaviorally. There's a lot of behaviors that overlap, coping with negative affect, and I've just included so many references for you guys if you want to become an expert. There's just a lot of good studies in the last recent studies. Hopefully, if anything piques your attention, you can track down the reference. Comorbidity ranges somewhere between 3 and 50%, but also subclinical eating disorder, aka disordered eating, is also very common. Things like night eating, dieting, dietary restraint, body image issues, right? Body image issues don't always imply the presence of an eating disorder, right? So there's a lot that needs to be teased out and assessed on an individual level. There is some data that show binge eating disorder and bulimia for women in treatment, but it's definitely not just women. There's a lot of growing emerging data for men as well. The literature does show more bulimia and binge eating disorder compared to anorexia, and in my opinion, that's related to the way that the reward pathways in the brain work. Both bulimia and binge eating disorder have more pronounced changes in reward function relative to anorexia. So with men, we see the same thing: binging, distress about efforts to lose weight. Most people that have been in this field know that there's data on alcohol, again, focused mostly on deficiencies. This idea we can correct certain deficiencies we can be helpful, and I think that there's some truth to that. But what we're learning now about gut health is that there's more to the picture, and we're going to go there today. Turns out that ethanol alters the microbiome. We have human data to show dysbiosis related to alcohol consumption, increased oxidative stress, and decrease in short-chain fatty acids. Essentially what happens is the tight junction becomes disrupted, and there's opportunity for small particles, bacteria, to become translocated. So our way of understanding alcoholic liver disease has changed dramatically in the last few years. I think this is the best slide that I've found that does it justice. The assumption that I kind of was raised with was that the damage on the liver came from the ethanol. The acetaldehyde, affects the liver, but it turns out that the alcohol, as you can see, causes a state of dysbiosis, which leads to an inflammatory cascade, which leads to the disruption of the tight junction, which leads to the leakage. I know dietitians, we don't like the term leaky, but that's what's going on. Intestinal permeability, it's a real thing, and it's what happens with alcohol consumption. Turns out that the microbes and other particles enter the blood and then travel to the liver, and the liver damage associated with alcohol is not from the alcohol, but from the bacterial translocation to the liver. So there's promise in treating ALD with new ways, microbial-based treatments. By the way, I'm really interested in gut health, obviously. One of the most fascinating pieces to me is that having probiotics is great, and now we also know that you need the prebiotics as well. You can't just have the bacteria, you need the fiber. But the recent evidence is starting to suggest that those two alone aren't enough either. You need the polyphenols, right? You need the polyphenolic compounds that are in the food, which make the strong case for getting these things from whole foods that exist in synergy whenever possible. So there's a lot of promise for new treatment based on gut-based interventions. This really got my attention. It was shown that in alcoholic subjects, the intestinal permeability was correlated to depression and craving. So they were able to measure gut leakiness by inflammatory markers in the blood. At 3 weeks abstinence, those that had higher gut leakiness had higher levels of depression, anxiety, and craving. So it's posing this really important question. Is the damage that's being done to the gut affecting mental health, right? And this is the big kind of one of the major themes of this conference, I hope, is moving towards an understanding of neuroinflammation, how inflammatory cascades can travel to the brain. Once the gut is impaired, we're looking at reduction in bacterial diversity. So just to summarize, for those that are relatively new to the microbiome stuff, a healthier gut has a wider range of species, generally, and less healthful guts have a reduction in species. So, it might go from 1,000 down to 600. When there's less species, there's more opportunity for certain species to proliferate and grow and exert themselves. Reduction in bacterial diversity leads to inflammation, further increased permeability, further dysbiosis, and the cycle continues. I have a theory that a lot of people are living their lives in the red and aren't even aware of it, right? Aren't even aware of how great people can feel. And so I think this will get a lot more attention moving forward. I included this because it introduces the psychosocial factors back in. It turns out that stress, trauma, they also affect the microbiome. That also affects gut permeability. So we need to be able to look at these things from all different levels. Alcohol addiction and withdrawal has been proposed to be linked to neuroinflammation. Neuroinflammation can be studied. It can be researched, right? You can do imaging studies to find out what parts of the brain are inflamed. And the problem with it is it's expensive. Trying to do neuroinflammation studies at UCLA, they're like, yeah, it's $2,000 a scan. And it's like, okay. So the main point of this is like, let's get more awareness. Let's get more small studies done. Let's get more money available. Let's get this research going, because without it, we're just here talking. And that's the truth. So alcohol's been well described, there's protocols in place, but drug addiction has not. We know less about drug addiction, not just because of lack of funding, but because it's really hard to do research on this population. There's ethical challenges, legal challenges, there's poor follow-up, so most of the data that we have is underpowered, speculative, and mostly retrospective. So we're able to see people that present to the hospital and look at what problems already exist. It's very unlikely that we'll ever be able to do a true randomized controlled trial with heroin, right? So there's certain limitations to this kind of work. And that's important to know, right? It's important to know that we're going to be limited in our evidence base. We do the best that we can. Substance use disorder is a growing economic and social and emotional burden. There's no established standards of practice. There really isn't a lane yet for nutritionists. There's a lot of research in the other fields, but it hasn't really happened for us. There is a big trend though, and especially in the private sector, towards more holistic approaches. Things like acupuncture. There's a lot of treatment centers that are using chefs and meditation. There's a big trend in the private sector towards this, but guess what? In the private sector, there's almost never any data, right? So there's a gap between the private sector and the public sector that we can definitely bridge. In 1990, the Academy did publish a position paper urging dietitians to become essential members of the treatment team. Actually members of the treatment team, not like patched on, just the outside provider that runs a group, that like we would actually sit in on the treatment planning. And this is the agenda that I've been trying to carry forth. Nutrition care should be integrated into the treatment. Professionals were urged to take aggressive action to ensure involvement in recovery programs. Guess what happened? Nothing. 5 years later, the position paper was not renewed. There has been little progress. And the question is why? Is it because the RDs weren't interested? Is it because of the lack of evidence? Like, what is it, right? And I've been interested in figuring out and maybe getting some people excited about not only working in this area, but coming together and collecting some information so that we can substantiate our role. So there's limited funding, and that leads to no insurance coverage. So I've worked in a lot of different places in Los Angeles. If there's ever any budget issues, it's like one of the first things to go, right? So I've been able to integrate my company's services in places, but like it'll get cut as soon as there's a thing. So that's important to know as well. Addiction, nutrition isn't recognized by insurance. Obviously, eating disorders is, and that starts to get tricky with licensure, etc. With drug addiction, we know that there's a lot of malnutrition. There's criteria for hunger being met with a lot of people. Strong preference for sweets. I think most people that work in this field know. Strong preference for low fiber, highly palatable food, and that usually comes with a low intake of fruits and vegetables. Micronutrients are low, which lead to antioxidant deficiencies. Inflammation is high. There's actually one study that shows the antioxidant disturbance can actually be implicated in relapse, and these are the things that I'm interested in. In one study in Norway, it showed added sugar was responsible for 30% of the food intake, and most of the respondents prefer sugar and sugar-sweetened foods. A couple studies on cocaine have shown a link between the polyunsaturated fatty acids and anxiety. There hasn't been a lot there, but I wanted to include this just so we can start to think about this entire picture. I'm going to talk today about fiber, but omega-3 is a big part of this. It just hasn't been specifically studied much for addiction. But the gut, that's what we're going to talk most about today. There is data, and I'm sure this graph doesn't do it much justice, to show that those who take drugs have an altered microbiome. What that means, we don't really know, but we can make some educated guesses. My best guess is that if we target altering the microbiome, there's some other physiological changes that can come with that can improve our outcomes. It was shown that mice in an animal model that were given cocaine had reduced bacterial diversity and had changes in their behavioral response to the drugs. So there's something there, and the implications are to be determined. With meth, we know that there's a lot of reduced eating patterns. I think no one's shocked to hear that. We do have data to show changes in hormones. There is some really interesting data to show that those who use speed are nearly twice as likely to become obese than those who use opioids. And it starts to beg the question, is it because appetite suppression leads to ravenous return appetite later, or are people that have weight issues more drawn to using speed as a weight control mechanism? And these are the things that I'm super interested in. So there is data on meth and gut that I'll just breeze through really quickly. It's the same as alcohol, right? When you use drugs, it causes dysbiosis and increases inflammation, and the inflammation travels to the brain. These are hypothesized effects of meth, crossing the blood-brain barrier and leading to anxiety, eating disorders, sleep disorders, etc. So it's this really important question: what can we do to heal the gut and hopefully heal the brain? The challenge with this, and I think most of you guys know, is it doesn't happen overnight. It's not like, oh, let's start using a nutrition intervention. Like, nutrition is slow. When you're talking about reducing inflammation through nutrition, it's the kind of thing that happens over not days and weeks, but like months and years. And that's another reason why it's really hard to study. And most people don't, like, it's hard to conceptualize an intervention that's like, no, this is going to take 3 to 6 months before you feel any different. But that's what we're really looking at. Okay, opioid users traditionally prefer quick, cheap, convenient, sweet foods, low fiber, easily digestible, things like ice cream, things like cereal, etc. Fiber consumption is really typically low. And I think it makes a lot of sense. Opioids shut down the gastrointestinal tract, and so it's very difficult to consume real food, and we'll talk about that. There is data of deficiencies linked to heroin, some of which go all the way back to the late 70s and early 80s, if anyone's interested in deficiency data. Most people that work with opioids know that there is significant constipation while using, and then oftentimes diarrhea and early recovery. Sometimes a fluctuation between the two, and it's a major source of distress for opioid addicts. But think about this for a second. If someone is highly constipated, and sometimes people don't have a bowel movement for a week, 10 days, I've heard 2 weeks. Think about the motionless environment in the gastrointestinal tract and what that could imply in terms of bacterial growth, right? As opposed to passing stuff through every 12 to 72 hours the way a quote-unquote normal person would do, there's this really slow asleep environment that can make significant changes in microbiome. One study in an animal model showed there was a particular strain of bacteria that was increased by 100-fold in the animals that were given morphine. So it starts to pose these questions, like, is it possible that maybe that there's bacteria that also like opioids and that would grow as a result of that, or is it just from the motionless environment? I do think that there's a lot of possibility because we're seeing bacteria that have preference for things like iron, that prefer all of these artificial sweeteners. But who knew? There's bacteria that love artificial sweeteners. This idea that there's bacteria that like opioids wouldn't be a surprise to me. So we certainly don't have those answers, but it's something important to start thinking about. With opioids, we have, like I said, low fiber intake, foods that require minimal digestion, and there's often rapid weight gain and early recovery. Those that work with this population, it's not uncommon to see someone gain 30 pounds in 30 days. And I think there's an assumption that, if someone's underweight, let's get them to gain the weight back as fast as possible. And my experience suggests that these are things that need to be thought about. In other words, maybe 30 pounds is too much. But then it comes to this question of what do you need to talk about it with them? You need to weigh them, right? And there's a lot of other things that need to be considered on an individual basis. 70% of women in one study reported weight concerns in early recovery. So it gets tricky, right? If weight-related issues drive substance use and it's not addressed in treatment, a core etiological factor will remain unaddressed. And then it's how to address it? Think about it. If someone goes to a treatment center for 2 months, they gain 40 pounds, none of their clothes fit, it increases the likelihood of returning to the substance, right? And that isn't a thing that we've talked or thought about much. We certainly want to consider it, and then knowing what we know about eating disorders, the last thing you want to do is start putting people on diets, right? So again, it's an art to be able to understand an individual's needs. Caffeine and nicotine are common in addiction treatment settings. They're often used for synergy. It used to be the coffee and the cigarette, now it's the energy drink and the vape, right? These have gotten really common. Some places will regulate these substances and others will completely let them do what they want. But these things significantly affect appetite as well as affect oral health and are part of the overall picture. So caffeine and nicotine management are things that I do as a dietitian. Caffeine's no longer just coffee and tea, it's in energy drinks, it's everywhere. It's definitely an addictive drug, and I know that makes some people uncomfortable. But it can be very problematic for people when they're using 1,500 milligrams a day, 4 monsters, and it's definitely something to think about. Again, nicotine suppresses appetite. People that also vape and smoke are less likely to enjoy the taste of regular food. So if someone's in early recovery and they're smoking and vaping all day long, they're probably gonna prefer more salt, more flavor. So their relationship to food is indirectly altered by the cigarettes and the vape. I've gotten people off vapes and off smoking, and like the way that they experience food changes, and they're able to eat foods that they weren't able to eat before. You get their gut working again. Now all of a sudden a nutrition intervention is possible. So there's a lot of barriers in this population. I think I've talked to a lot of dietitians who work in this field, and eventually it's like, I tried, you know, like the population didn't receive me all that well. I didn't feel like my message was important, and I quit, right? It's like at some point, there's so many barriers, especially in early recovery. A week sober, 2 weeks sober, sometimes it's the last thing people want to talk about. Other times the work can be very meaningful. So to understand all the physiology of addiction as well as the barriers and the best way to message it is the best bet. 13.5% of vapers reported doing so for weight loss and weight control. I don't want to spend much time on hormones, but I do want to say that it's a big part of the puzzle. Gut bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids, and these are communication networks that can turn into hormones. It's the communication network from the gut back to the brain. The 3 major hormones of importance for addiction are leptin, insulin, and ghrelin, because they communicate to the hypothalamus, which is the appetite center in the brain, and the hypothalamus calibrates the dopamine system. So this diagram makes it a little bit clearer than perhaps the first one. It's not just neurotransmitters that are coming from the gut, but the signals of hormones, it all gets to the brain where it gets integrated. A particular part of the hypothalamus that I'm interested in is the arcuate nucleus, and great stuff to know about as a dietitian. So the big picture goals are typically not weight focused. We're focusing on overall health, body, mind, spirit, helping people change their behaviors, develop self-efficacy, become restored to sanity. Recovery is different from person to person, and it's important to remember that people have different definitions of recovery. Abstinence was the thing a long time ago, and there's a lot of models now that are based on harm reduction and medication-assisted treatment, etc. So we have to be open-minded to all the different stuff that's out there. Eventually help people develop a relationship to food and exercise that is intuitive and personal, and always avoiding the quick fix. So intuitive eating is big in the nutrition and dietetic world, and the question is like, can we trust our body wisdom? If someone's in early recovery, their gut is inflamed, their addiction is through the roof, hormones are unstable, they haven't been trained in mindfulness, it's not safe to assume that someone's going to be able to effectively carry out intuitive eating. So if you can help people recover, you can move them towards that goal. I've had the experience where you carry that message to someone too soon and they fail miserably and they feel misunderstood. So as someone that works with the eating disorder, I know this idea of good versus bad is usually unhelpful, potentially harmful. However, when it comes to addiction, we can start to make some discernings between foods that are gut healing and gut harming, foods that are addictive and foods that are non-addictive. And addiction is characterized by black and white thinking. So being able to work with someone's framework that way can be helpful if done properly. Most people report that eating less processed foods and more whole foods improves their mood, improves their wellness. And we've always known that, you eat better, you feel better. Like we've always known, we didn't really know why until now. We actually know why. What we eat has a profound effect on our gut bacteria, and our gut bacteria affects our brain. So a lot of the stuff that's added into processed foods, emulsifiers and things like that, have a negative impact on the microbiome, which affects things like anxiety, depression, etc. So understanding addictive pathways is important. A lot of treatment centers say this, like, give them unlimited access to highly palatable foods and they'll be happier. And that model has been around for a while. But these questions are starting to come up. Does serving unlimited, highly palatable foods lead to more impulsivity? Does it lead to more addiction? Does it reinforce addictive pathways in the brain? We wrote this article about a year ago in our parent organization's journal. I did propose group topics for addiction treatment. There's almost never a discussion of calories or math. We're talking about eating for mental health, gut microbiome, caffeine, nicotine, body image, disordered eating, cooking, etc. Other things that I talk about, which I don't think most people would necessarily be able to do, is things like cross-addiction, craving, impulsivity, the stuff linked to neuroscience, delayed discounting. And I say this because it's sensitive, right? You have to be able to message it properly or don't do it at all. There are positive associations between nutrition interventions and addiction outcomes that have been seen in the VA system, the prison system, with women that have body image issues. We did an intervention at a treatment center in LA and showed some positive outcomes. Important consideration, medications do affect gut bacteria significantly. We've always known that there's changes in weight, changes in eating behavior linked to medications, and I think in the last few years we started to really elucidate the mechanisms which are at the gut level. We definitely need to consider reducing prescriptive care that's contraindicated in the condition of substance abuse. Some data shows that opioids modulate the immune system and cause microbiome alteration. A lot of the medications that are common in addiction treatment, things like Seroquel, directly affect the growth of organisms within the gut. So this is an important thing to know. What it means is to be determined, but oftentimes people are gaining weight and you might make an assumption that it's because of changes in eating, but it actually might be changes in gut bacteria, and that's important as well. These researchers from Ireland, I'm a big fan of Cryan and Dinnan, and they've shown increased permeability linked to certain psychotropic medications, and more on that for sure. Other evidence recently shows that higher quality diets with omega-3, probiotics, prebiotics can reduce depression, anxiety, as well as stress-related symptoms. And this is where it gets tricky. It's like in addiction treatment, it's like you want to eat as healthy as possible. But if someone has an eating disorder, that could be problematic. So how do you tease out the differences and find a balance between the two? That's the work. To understand the gut-brain axis, we must understand the vagus nerve, the HPA axis. We need to think about psychobiotic, gut-based treatments. These are new avenues for treating depression and anxiety. But here's the real part. Like, we know this information. I provide this information to my clients and to my patients, meaning I get them excited about nutrition in a new way. It's not just like, oh, there's data on this. It's like, no, this is what we're doing. We're not doing calorie counting. I don't care about your vitamins and minerals. We're intervening on your gut. We're going to use fiber. We're going to change your gut physiology, and that's going to change your mental health. Your homeostatic system will come back online, and things are going to get different. And they're way more interested to get on board with that message versus like, all right, here's your meal plan. It's like, no, we're going to just do the gut. And there's a lot of ways people do the gut, but if you think of the gut as just like high fiber, high polyphenols, right, things of that nature, chia seed soaked in water, get people excited about healing their gut, they end up eating in a different way. And over time they start to feel better, and then they can start trusting their body signals more. And that's why I've been effective in working with this population. It's not just the information, but how it's messaged, and most importantly, how you can get people excited about it. So we know that there's links to be determined. Most people know serotonin, 90%, 95% produced in the gut. Dopamine, over 50% has an intestinal source. You tell someone in early recovery that. You say, listen, your neurotransmitters are produced in your gut. Let's do something about it. And all of a sudden, they're more interested than the classic generic nutrition message that they've been receiving for too long. So in terms of treatment, what does this all imply, right? We need differential treatments. With trauma history, there's a lot of great stuff that's out there. Neuroscience is leading to pharmaceutical interventions, nutraceutical interventions, nutrition interventions, and this is bringing it back to the bio-psycho-spiritual model of health, which I am a big fan of. So the Western diet's low in fiber, it's high in sugar, and it's high in artificial sweeteners. It's also high in omega-6. A proposed solution is the opposite. Just do the opposite. Higher in fiber, lower in sugar, lower in artificial sweeteners, and then higher in omega-3. You give someone this information, they're like, I can work with that. I can move in that direction. Gut-brain, brain-gut, that's the key message from today. Reintroducing fiber is not an easy task. It needs to be gradual and progressive. If someone's been on opioids for 10 years, they're unlikely to be able to eat a big plate of lentils and broccoli, right? It might have to be 1 baby carrot, and then tomorrow you go to 2 baby carrots, and then you throw in a cherry tomato. It might just be that slow because the gut is not ready to be able to break down high fibrous loads. It has to do with enzymes, it has to do with gut bacteria. So I usually increase fiber intake slowly over time, and I found that to be helpful. I do emphasize getting fiber from food, not from supplements. Emphasizing raw when possible. I'm a big fan of beans, nuts, and seeds, and teaching people to eat from a wide range of foods. Never hungry, never full is one of my little mantras. Teach people to stay away from extremes, right? Things like intermittent fasting and ketogenic, they all might be great for people out there in the world, but if you have altered neurochemistry, it is contraindicated, right? And to be able to explain that to someone, it might work great for your cousin, but with your history of addiction, your neurochemistry is sensitive, it can actually cause you more harm than good. And then people get that. They understand that because of the neuroscience piece. Eating disorder, nutrition therapy, again, avoiding any dietary extremes, getting people in a pattern, right? Regular meals, regular snacks, balanced, having food as a group. And recovery in any kind of treatment center always starts with the staff. So regular staff trainings, regular staff meetings is critical. You can have a treatment center where someone means well and they're talking diet supplements with someone and it's causing more harm than good. The staff is super, super important. Behaviors to watch for: binging, skipping, dieting, leaving after the meal, laxatives, teas, weight loss supplements, hiding food, talking about food, who they follow on social media. These are all really important things that I look at with people. I will ask someone let's look at who you're following. Show me your feed, right? We'll just go and unfollow stuff. That can be an important intervention for body image and eating disorder stuff. So I believe that a calorie is not a calorie. And I believe we have to stop saying that it is about the food. That there is something we can do at a nutrition level, and it requires an aggressive intervention, not just like sitting back and waiting for things to happen. We need to think about policy, big picture stuff, which is what I'm doing at the public health level. Supplements can be great, and I'm about to recommend some, but I do believe in a behavioral intervention. I do believe that the emphasis has to be on their relationship to food. You give someone this idea of going from pills, powders, and potions to pills, powders, and potions, and they're open to it, right? But this idea of learning how to cook, learning how to eat differently, that's the real work, right? And I believe in this stuff. Cooking classes, life skills, grocery shopping, meal planning, etc. It's all, kitchen cleaning is also big. I talk to people about their barriers to cooking, and you find out they really just don't like to do the pots and pans, right? You realize that they don't want to cook because they don't want to clean up. And so learning how to teach someone how to clean is a part of a nutrition intervention. And those aren't things that we often think about. They don't want to clean the blender, so they buy a smoothie. It's a thing. We collected a data set recently and was published not long ago about the presence of nutrition services in Los Angeles. We used the SAMHSA website to find a list of facilities. Out of 128 in our final sample, only 39 of them in the greater LA area offered any nutrition services at all. And out of those 39, only 8 used a registered dietitian nutritionist. So overall, RDNs are represented at less than 7% of addiction treatment centers in our sample in Los Angeles. So we could be doing way more. I don't necessarily know that it's, us, but we could definitely take this information, market ourselves, be involved. There's definitely a need for policy changes, and I promise you guys I'm working on it. These are overall recommendations for all substance use disorders. I'm not going to read every single one. It's in a chapter that's coming out in a week or two. Happy to share it with you guys. But this is like broad recommendations related to water, plant proteins, whole grains, an anti-inflammatory diet, all stuff that you guys know a lot about. Increasing fiber intake, beans, chia seeds. Timing is important. Eating breakfast like in the morning, like right away is important in my experience. Give people an option and they'll skip, they'll wait. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. The longer someone waits to eat, the higher the dopamine response is to the food. So if someone's in early recovery, they're living a life without even knowing it, seeking a dopamine response. Caffeine, nicotine, sugar, postponed eating, it's all designed to maximize the dopaminergic response. So they will skip just so that when they finally do eat, it's amazing, right? Hunger has always been the best sauce. So people do that sometimes unintentionally, and to provide people with that information is certainly helpful. Caffeine, etc. With opioids, I've recommended protein ranges. This is based on all the available evidence. The sweet tooth is hard to get around. I do use things like dried fruit and frozen fruit and other things like that. Certainly there's a need for sweets and things like that in early recovery, and you want to be supportive. Nutrition should never be punitive. It should always be framed as a supportive part of someone's recovery. Certain supplemental recommendations, multivitamin, omega-3, probiotics, these are things that can be helpful, but should always be assessed on an individual basis. I often put people with opioid use disorder out in the sunlight. They haven't gotten a lot of sun. Sometimes putting someone on sunlight therapy, 30 minutes, 2-3 times a week, can make a drastic change. And those are the little things that we as dietitians can do and should step out of our lane a little bit. We need a lot more information about a lot of different things. Polyphenols, gut health, immune support. What strains are the best? We don't know. That should be assessed on an individual basis. Magnesium, genetic testing, amino acid therapy, co-occurring addiction, eating disorder, mindful eating, best topics, best groups, how to collect data. There's a lot that we need. And I don't think if we all tackled it on an individual basis that we would get anywhere. We need to come together. There is a dietetic practice group called Behavioral Health Nutrition, and there is, yes, and we have a group of RDs that do addictions, and we're really small, and we need growth. We need more people. And we got April in the back, who is our incoming chair. So what can the RDN do as a member of the treatment team? Every patient who walks into an addiction treatment should be assessed by a behavioral health dietitian, screened for eating disorders, request labs, run groups, individual counseling, collect data, publish findings, educational curriculum, special events, treatment planning, work with the team, doctors, therapists, other counselors, etc. Nutrition, exercise, behavior change, and then of course, food service, right? To audit the menu, suggest substitutions, changes, etc. I've worked with a lot of chefs. Turns out, like, you know, in reality, like a lot of treatment team, if they had to choose between the dietitian and the chef, they have to choose the chef. It's a requirement. And so that's an important dynamic that we need to start thinking more about. We need money to make it all work. There's a big funding push through the NIH with addiction money. And we're talking big money. And if you look at all the agendas, nutrition is not on there, right? Unfortunately, it hasn't made it that far yet. Hopefully the Center for Complementary and Integrative Health can, see some hope there. I just heard the other day that a lab in Boston, the Jackson lab, got $4 million to do addiction research with the microbiome. And there's a part of me, I just want to fly out there and go see what's good. It's exciting, so little things are happening. There's a bright future ahead for nutrition and addiction. It is not enough to stare up the steps. We must step up the stairs. It will require action. And we definitely need to go upstream to look at the social determinants of health, all the supply side theory, all the different things that are driving the crises. We need to consider the whole picture. My food philosophy is all foods fit, but not all foods fit for all people. And just because the food industry manufactures it and sells it does not mean we have to include it. And food for thought is no substitute for the real thing. You guys were awesome today. Thank you so much. Yes.
Wow. David, thank you. And I'm not sure you noticed, but your dietetics professor was beaming with pride.
Yes.
Yes, she was. Full of energy, really appreciate that you challenge each of us to go out and do this differently, and thank you that you challenge us to do it by also honoring with no shame. And I love that. You guys have a lot of questions, so David, you're going to be so excited. I know many of you could not find the slides. I think it is a downloading problem. Just know I will go directly to the speaker's room and have them work on if there's any problem behind the scenes, but I also know David well enough to know he wants you to get it. So how can they access the slides since they're having trouble on their app?
So I confirmed it on the app. If you go into the session and you slide down, there is a thing that takes you to the slides, and then there's a button on the top that takes you to the web version. And from the web version, you can email it to yourself. So I confirmed that, and if anyone has a continued problem, I'm happy to reply to an email with them, but please check the app first.
And I want y'all to know that David specifically, we're going to spend 30 minutes answering questions if we can, because the next session isn't until 3:30. So hang out if you can. We're going to get to as many questions as possible. David, how successful are these interventions with individuals who are of low socioeconomic status or low education levels? Thank you.
It's such a great question, and I guess I can sit here. It's unfortunate without insurance coverage. As a private practice dietitian, the majority of people that I see are socioeconomically advantaged, right? I do private pay. So it's an important question that I'm bringing to my doctoral training. Working in the field for the last 6 years, I have worked mostly in the private sector. And so I'm certainly interested in how we can serve underserved populations much better, but have limited personal experience with it.
Thank you. In your experience, what have been strategies to help people in recovery from opioid addiction not use food as a substitute? What are some strategies to prevent symptom swapping? I know you addressed some of this, but it's a very high-rated question.
Okay. There's a lot of debate on what to prioritize in terms of recovery. There's old models that would suggest, if you get rid of one thing, let the other stuff do their thing. Let them have it, right? Caffeine, nicotine, sugar. Newer data, especially related to the nicotine thing, is suggesting that the more stuff you stop at once, the more likely the brain is to heal. Food is often the final frontier, right? It's a thing that ends up being problematic for people at 2 years sober, at 3 years sober. And I think that trying to aggressively address it before someone's necessarily ready can be harmful. It can also let someone feel like there's someone taking something away from them. But I think in my experience, just being a safe place for someone to talk about these things is the beginning of that. For someone, it's when they're 6 weeks sober. For someone else, it's when they're 6 months. And for someone else, it's when they're 6 years. And I believe that timing is important. On a publication I wrote, I suggested that nutrition intervention should be different at weeks, months, and years, because they're at different stages of their neurochemical recovery.
And on that note, I know you had a slide about it, but what is the exact month and year journal in which you were published for JAND for us? When was that published?
Believe it or not, it came on an online thing about a year ago, and is still as an online only. I think it takes that long to be in print, but if you Google Wiss Journal Academy of Nutrition, it'll come up.
Okay, another great question. I've read about marijuana impacting the gut in a positive way. Have you read any research about this and it having any negative impact?
No, I'm not an expert on the intersection between marijuana and gut health. I am aware of some of the positives, but it's like any other research question. You have to consider all the confounding variables, right? It's be really hard to just link that. What other behaviors come along with marijuana that would be either helpful or harmful to gut health?
What is your opinion regarding Ensure supplement use among patients with substance abuse who have experienced significant weight loss? So many of the doctors and clinicians I work with rely heavily on supplementation, even if the patient's appetite and oral intake improves following withdrawal.
In general, I'm not a big fan. You know what I mean? It's like, when did that become the role of the dietitian? I think that it's a crisis management thing. I see it as crisis management. However, there is some data to show that the liquid forms of multivitamins can be beneficial relative to a pill. So having all those vitamins and minerals in a liquid form can be helpful when the gut is compromised. But at the end of the day, a lot of people in early recovery, they prefer those things because they're just like, they taste like milkshakes. They're just like more of the highly palatable sugar, and they're great with it. The doctor wants me to have it, I'll have it. Everyone's happy, right? But it doesn't have the stuff that we need to heal the gut, which is fiber, real polyphenols, and all the stuff we talked about today.
Okay. Do you feel there is any benefit to a long-term, strictly low-carbohydrate diet for recovered addicts struggling with intense carbohydrate cravings?
I could never answer a nutrition question on a broad level like that. Typically, I would say that would be the right thing for some people. We need to know more about the link between carbohydrates and certain neurotransmitters, serotonin in particular. But the benefits there, in my experience, though, to speak broadly, having a diet that's more balanced is much safer in terms of the neurochemical outcomes.
Speaking of biochemistry, do emulsifiers from unprocessed foods like lecithin negatively affect the gut microbiome?
There is some data to show yes. I think that's a really interesting area of research, right? Like a lot of the stuff that's added into foods, it's benign, right? The colors and the artificial sweeteners and the things, they do have negative effects on gut microbiome, which might explain why when people move to a more whole foods diet, they feel better. It might be the reason why, because that has stopped.
Hang on. Okay, a new question popped up, getting a ton of points. How can we help clients that are still going through addiction move into the stage of change where they're ready to use nutrition as a gateway to recovery?
In my experience, the key is just being a bright light and being excited and showing up and having them be interested in who you are. The information is not the missing gap. The thing is the connection and the relationship. If you show up at a place and you get their spirit's attention and they're interested in you, then the opportunity to deliver the message presents itself. And that's the real work, is building rapport. If you show up to a treatment center and you're just going through a menial job and you don't love it, they're not going to be interested at all. If you go in there beaming and you can't wait to give them the newest information, all of a sudden their attention is there, and now there's a totally new avenue for change.
So how can more of us get involved with individuals with substance abuse in our community? What do you recommend as dietitians?
It's a great question. I get my referrals from therapists. I mean, LA is a huge treatment bubble. Next to my office, there's 1,000 sober livings, right? So in a different area, that could be different. But getting involved in the addiction treatment community is a really good place to start. Some of the early work that I did, I was just let me come in and run a group, and you see what they say. And then you market yourself. I volunteered when I was a dietetic intern. I taught a class and I did a thing in the courthouse, and it picks up steam if you like it. You have to like it. Otherwise, I've known a lot of people that try this thing and then stop. So finding the intersection, and dose matters. If you're running a group every day or something like that, you can burn out quickly. I learned what's the appropriate amount of groups for me to run and still feel optimized.
Really highly encourage, basically, second everything David just said. In your community, search them out. They are truly emotionally and physically hungry for information on nutrition, and I find that's it. You come in with passion and simple, but you don't have to know everything. David's an amazing resource. I always refer them to his website and get them to follow him, but they're so hungry for information, and just offering a group a quarter, or even just a nutrition session for families to support them as well. Just highly recommend that. Okay, let's see. Why do you think that some heavy drinkers develop liver damage whereas others do not?
I think from the data that we reviewed today, my two best educated guesses is one, more increased gut permeability, leading to the bacterial translocation transported to the liver. And then two is the other confounding variables, other lifestyle stuff, other factors that affect the immune system, et cetera, which is really hard to control for in research. With large data sets, you can only make correlations.
Okay. When and how, or where and how do you recommend dietitians start to learn more about neuroscience as it relates to nutrition in the areas that you've talked about?
That's a great question. I have a bias towards always going to the source. I'm an academic, so I read peer-reviewed journal articles, and I found that that's how I have learned. There's probably some really good books out there. A colleague of mine, Dr. Lustig, put out a book in the last year, Hacking of the American Mind. And he talks about sugar addiction, and he does a primer on neurochemistry in the first half of the book that I think does a really digestible way of understanding the dopamine system and the hormones, et cetera. But the book gets into stuff that I know is controversial, so might not be for everyone, but I could suggest that with confidence.
When someone has gained excessive weight during recovery and are starting to develop related diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, how do you continue to keep weight out of the conversation?
So keeping weight out of the conversation is more like an early recovery at a treatment setting when people are really sensitive. If someone has weight management issues and chronic disease associated, then it wouldn't necessarily be out of the conversation.
Okay.
It's more for early recovery because of the known co-occurring susceptibility with eating disorders. Oftentimes people have underlying food stuff and it's been quiet, dormant, and then it pops up in the first week, month of sobriety. So that's a really sensitive time.
Where can I find more information on ACE scores, and how does the Addiction RD use this?
The ACE literature is pretty robust. It came out of the Kaiser system, and there's a lot of studies that have shown dose response graded links between the amount of ACE scores. So if you were to go into Google Scholar and do ACE adverse childhood experiences and Kaiser, there's a couple big authors, alcohol, drugs, it's been really well described.
I told you, a lot of questions. You love this.
I love it.
I know you. Have you done any work with women who are breastfeeding an infant I'm trying to read the question, sorry, to treat neonatal abstinence syndrome while they are receiving methadone treatment?
I have not treated someone with that case. I'm familiar and heard of situations, but have no direct personal experience.
Okay. Can you recover 100% from gut leakiness?
Well, we live in a world that is filled with a lot of environmental challenges, and one of the major criticisms of like some of the tests that are out there is like most people have gut problems. And it's almost can probably be if you're the best eater around, because the gut issues are no longer just food. We're thinking about all of the, antibiotics and plastics and things in the world. So one of the biggest criticisms of the markers that look at gut leakiness and stuff like that, I've done a lot of the tests just because I'm curious. And yeah, like it turns out like, there's a need to really clarify that. So 100% is a strong word that I would never say yes to.
I know you cannot, this one I keep avoiding, but it's coming back. I know you cannot endorse any particular probiotic, but can you share your personal regimen? Do you take probiotics, and what do you take?
Oh.
Is that appropriate?
I do use probiotics, and I'm curious about stuff. It's a tax write-off for me. I try a lot of the different things, and I have found that companies that use like 15 strains seem to be the best. They have strains now that are like purported to reduce anxiety. So they're coming out with probiotics that are more tailored towards mood improvement that I think I'm way more interested in that than like, for example, strains for weight management, et cetera. But 50 billion is like the minimum for me.
Okay. Many people battling opioid addiction or are in recovery have an active desire to improve their nutrition. What is your advice in regard to working with these clients who do not have access to a kitchen or a place to store food?
Well, there's a way to make it work in any situation if someone understands like why, if they're excited about it. And so that in a situation like that, I would focus less on the like what to eat, right, and focus more on the why and the how, if that makes sense, and the when. I use that model a lot when we're working with people. Sometimes they come in and I focus on the when. Like, let's just get into a rhythm with food. Let's get into a thing, and then we can move into the what to eat, and then we can move into like the how, where you bring in mindful eating and things of that nature. That framework works really well for me. But if people understand why they should do certain things and they know a little bit more about what that includes, it can motivate behavior.
Given 70% of women in addiction recovery have weight concerns, how do you break through the intense desire to lose weight? Do you combine your approach with health at every size?
Yes, I do. I've been able to talk a lot of people out of weight loss, but I also learned that, you want to build rapport. You want people to people need to feel heard. So combating those things and arguing against someone's goals usually doesn't work well. You usually don't have much left to do with them. So when people have concerns that might seem unsafe to me, I don't argue with them. I receive them and I say, oh, I totally understand. And then you find your angle to work with them. I think that the nutrition counseling is such an art that needs to be honed over the years. To have people feel well received and well understood is everything.
I know that research definitely supports that the strongest indicator of more resilient recovery, certainly in eating disorders, and I know it would relate to addictions as well, is the relationship solely, like wins out over information, what's being eaten, when it's being eaten. It's the relationship. So it all goes back to that. So I feel like I totally second that as well. What about Truvia and the gut? What do you feel about?
Hate to break it to everyone, but stevia is an artificial sweetener. Okay? I'm sorry. They got the leaf on the thing. It came from a leaf, but like it was synthesized in a laboratory. It's the same thing that was in the leaf. There's not enough stevia leaves to be feeding the world stevia anymore, right? It's a perfect example of the health halo. It's the genius of the food industry. You make people think that it's healthy, and there's a gap between when the data comes out. Everyone believes it's healthy and it's amazing, and everyone picks it. If I had to pick an artificial sweetener, I would probably pick that one, but there is data to show that it has a similar effect, which is a reduction in bacterial diversity.
How will I be able to convince the powers that be at my state facility to invest in gut health?
If you find out, the powers that be question. Like I said earlier, I think starting off, like making a case, the chapter that's coming out this week has all the latest evidence in the last few years with the recommendations, bringing the review of the evidence, saying I want to like start this, run a group, limited budget, and let's see what happens, can be a good start. And I think as the topic continues to gain more popular press, people will become more open to it. But I think it's years out. I really do. I think this stuff is still 10 years out.
For those of us who may have missed it the first time, when is that chapter coming out? And how would we find it?
It's a great question.
I made that one up.
Yes. So, the chapter that I've spent a year working on has been a year sitting, and it's coming out like in 4 days. And I'm going to put it on my website, nutritionandrecovery.com, the information about it. But it's called Nutrition in Addiction Recovery, What We Know and What We Don't. And I think it'll be behind a paywall for most people.
Okay. Just a couple more questions. What do you think about the many fermented products out there, such as kefir?
I think they're fantastic. With alcohol and drug addiction, you have to be very careful with some of the beverages. Kombucha tea, for example, has trace amount of alcohol in it. So be very mindful when looking at fermented beverages if dealing with an alcohol population. I think they're helpful, but I think a lot of people can get misconstrued perception that like they're doing all they can for their gut because they had a yogurt, right? It's just like, it's not enough. It's not a high enough dose. It's coming in at the wrong spot. It's just insufficient alone, but as part of a high fiber plan can be fantastic. One of my ultimate like snacks, treats, desserts that I consume and also recommend, if you take a bowl of frozen fruit, like frozen cherries or frozen blueberries, and you pour the full fat, unsweetened kefir on it, it kind of freezes around it, and then you can mash it a little so the cherries leak, and then some crunchies on top. Y'all know what I'm talking about. And you get a good, bowl. Cold, creamy, delicious, chunky dessert in addiction recovery. It works great.
Okay, thank you. How long do skin issues with meth take to resolve? What are, if any, recommendations you suggest to clients?
Yeah, oral issues and skin issues are important. And they're linked to the immune system as well. So everyone's going to be different, but the key is to give people hope. Hey, listen, like with the right amount of sleep, right, getting the right amount of food in, staying abstinent, let's get you some sunlight, like in time you will heal. You can become recovered. And to give people, paint a picture of a healthy life and invite them to join. It's important. Because there's sometimes timelines are difficult. Sometimes people have damage that isn't always reversible.
Do you do a lot of nutrition education with the families of those that are addicted? And if so, how? And what is the best approach to get them more involved in their recovery?
I have. Many years ago, I was at a treatment center as a outside contractor where they did Family Week, and they brought me in to do a family thing to talk about it, and I believe that created an important synergy. The reality is, if we can't even get nutrition sessions covered for the patient, how are we going to get it covered for the family? Let's start with the patient there, but it's a great idea for future work.
Last question, is the sweet preference among opioid users related to the insulin dopamine hormonal pathway?
I am committed to figuring out the mechanism there because it's more pronounced with that drug. It's definitely neurochemical. It might be microbial, but there's another pathway there that makes the sweets with the opioids particularly reinforcing, and I'm trying to figure that out. I would love to be the guy that describes that in the literature.
I think we covered, let me see, there's a couple more if we still have, okay, we do. Why does cocaine decrease gut species in mice?
We don't know. The same reason why medications change bacteria. The assumption is the substance itself in the system causes changes. My best guess is that for example, when there's a drug that's in the gut, you'll probably grow certain bacteria that are needed to help break that down. And as certain strains grow, other strains reduce and possibly disappear. That's a guess. The other, possibility is that those substances are also related to other changes in eating patterns and enzymes, but that research is all really new, and I see that happening in the future.
Okay. How would one know if they have a healthy gut? And on that, we'll end our questions.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of testing. I think people would prefer to see hard data. The conclusions that come from places like, Ubiome and the home testing kits can be helpful, but, they give you like a wellness match score, like how much you match against the rest of the population. So those things can be fun, because if you send in your stool sample, they match it to like the 10 million other people that sent it in, and they give you data relative to the rest of the population. And in my opinion, that data is more relevant compared to everyone else, as opposed to like what would be ideal versus. And then at a more practical level, like, regularity of bowel movements and the consistency of it. I think most people that have gut issues know, right? And that my final point, and this is something I learned recently, is that the best indicator of someone's health, at least in a lot of literature, is their self-rated health. Best way to in terms of figuring out it's the most cost-effective and it's the best way to figure out someone's health is to ask them how do you rate your health on it? When people know when their health is impaired versus up. So that's a data answer as well as a kind of more survey social science answer.
Okay, I have to ask this last question. I promise this is it. Cutting under the wire, what are the top 3 things we can do as the RDN on the team to get the patient off the hamster wheel of addiction? What can we do, top 3?
I think that getting someone excited about a different life is the beginning. Painting the picture of a different life and then including things like nutrition, exercise, sunlight, yoga, and getting them to buy in, and then being around to support them for the long term. Doing follow-up. I've checked on people. I encourage people to check back with me. Send me an email in 3 months. I want to hear from you. And I'm able to do that because addiction is a chronic relapsing thing, and addiction recovery rates are low. And I think we could do much more to improve the outcomes.
Another round of applause, period. I'm sure David will stand up here. If you have any other questions, you're welcome to come on up. But thank you for your time and your patience, and have a rest of the great day.